They used to call me poor. Not out loud, not directly, not in a way that could be confronted, but in a way that was far more precise. In the pause before someone answered me, in the glance that traveled over my clothes before meeting my eyes, in the polite smiles that carried no warmth, in the subtle way conversations shifted when I entered the room, like a radio changing frequency. In her world, wealth wasn't just money. It was oxygen. It was a language everyone spoke without realizing it. Glass towers reflected the sun onto spotless streets. Cars moved silently like shadows. People didn't walk. They floated from one appointment to another, guided by assistants, by schedules, by invisible systems designed to protect them from ever feeling small. I didn't belong there. I came from a world that was louder, slower, and imperfect. A world where elevators broke, where coffee was brewed at home, where life didn't arrive on time but arrived honestly. A world where things were fixed instead of replaced, where names mattered more than numbers, where neighbors still noticed when you were gone. I didn't have power in that world either, but I had place. Still, whenever I crossed into her universe, I felt like a stain on something white. A mistake that hadn't been erased yet. A reminder that something once existed before money rewrote the story. They didn't need to say anything. The silence said enough. And somewhere between those two worlds existed a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. I was a father. Not a public one. Not a legal one. Not a celebrated one. A hidden one. My daughter lived in a building I couldn't afford to enter without permission. She slept in a bedroom bigger than my entire apartment. She wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. Her life was designed, curated, protected, and monitored. And yet, every time she saw me, she ran. Not toward the cars, not toward the gifts, not toward the security guards. Toward me. That was the only place in her world where she didn't feel managed. We met in small places. Parks on the edge of the city. Cafes where nobody knew her name. A library once, where she whispered because she thought books could hear. Those were the only places where we were allowed to exist. Her mother called them visits. As if I were a service provider. As if fatherhood were a subscription that could be paused. She told me it was for the child's safety. For her image. For her future. She said the world was cruel. What she meant was, the world wouldn't forgive a billionaire for choosing a poor man. So she erased me. Not violently. Not dramatically. Quietly. My name disappeared from conversations. My face disappeared from photographs. My role disappeared from memory. I wasn't exiled. I was deleted. But children don't forget. They don't forget voices. They don't forget laughter. They don't forget who sits on the floor with them instead of above them. They don't forget who listens instead of instructs. And my daughter remembered me. She remembered that I didn't tell her who to be. I asked who she was. She remembered that I didn't schedule her emotions. I let her feel them. She remembered that when she failed, I didn't correct her. I sat beside her. That was my crime. I made her feel human in a world that was training her to become something else. At first, I thought I was doing the right thing by staying small. I told myself love was enough. I told myself presence was enough. I told myself that as long as she knew I existed, that was enough. But I underestimated how much space power takes. How it fills rooms. How it fills narratives. How it fills childhoods. At school, she was introduced as the daughter of, followed by a name people recognized. Never as herself. Never as a child. Never as someone who was still becoming. She was a future asset. A future a future responsibility. Never a present person. When she told her mother she felt tired, the answer was vitamins. When she said she felt sad, the answer was a vacation. When she said she felt lonely, the answer was activities. No one ever asked why. No one ever sat with her in the quiet long enough to hear it. Except me. In my small apartment, silence wasn't a problem. It was a companion. We cooked badly together. We laughed when things burned. We cleaned without rushing. We talked about nothing and everything. She once asked me why my couch didn't match my table. I told her I didn't choose them. Life did. She smiled like that answer meant something. She once asked me why I never bought new things. I told her because old things already knew how to stay. She thought about that for a long time. She once asked me why her mother always looked busy. I didn't answer, because I didn't want to teach her how to judge, only how to see. And she saw. She saw how her mother smiled differently in front of people than at home. She saw how success created distance. She saw how love became conditional when reputation was at risk. She saw how being valuable replaced being loved. And slowly, quietly, she began to understand something dangerous. That she was growing up inside a story that wasn't written for her happiness. It was written for continuation, preservation, legacy. And I was a threat to that. Not because I was loud, not because I was angry, but because I reminded her that another version of life existed. A smaller one, a slower one, a kinder one. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That's why they called me poor. Because poor means harmless. Poor means irrelevant. Poor means easily erased. They didn't call me absent. They didn't call me unloving. They didn't call me wrong. They called me poor. Because it was the only insult that justified removing me without admitting I mattered. But children don't measure worth the way adults do. They measure safety. They measure honesty. They measure who shows up when no one is watching. And I was always there. In the quiet. In the margins. In the places no one thought to monitor. In the moments that never make headlines. And one day, that would be enough to change everything. Because the world was about to learn something it had forgotten. You can buy comfort. You can buy influence. You can buy silence. But you cannot buy the place a child chooses when she finally understands what love feels like. And when she did, the story everyone thought was finished was only beginning. The first time she told me I couldn't come to her birthday, she tried to smile. She was 9, and she stood in front of me with a practiced calm that didn't belong to a child. Her hands were folded the way adults fold them when they're delivering bad news. Her voice was steady, too steady. Mom says it's better if you don't come this year. I didn't ask why. I already knew. A billionaire's daughter couldn't have a father who arrived by bus. So I nodded. I told her it was okay. I told her we'd celebrate another day. And I watched her walk away carrying guilt that didn't belong to her. That was when I realized something had shifted. The secret wasn't just protecting her mother anymore. It was starting to hurt my daughter. After that, the rules multiplied. Visits had to be scheduled. Calls had to be approved. Messages were sometimes unanswered, not because my daughter didn't write them, but because someone else decided whether they were necessary. I became a line item, optional, manageable, and slowly, without ever saying it directly, they tried to tame me into a memory. I began to notice how often my daughter checked the door when we met, how she lowered her voice, how she glanced at her watch even when there was no reason to hurry. Fear had entered the room. Not fear of me. Fear for me. She was afraid I would get into trouble for existing. That a child would feel responsible for protecting her father from her own world. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. She once asked me what would happen if people found out about us. I told her nothing bad would happen. It was a lie. But it was the kind you tell a child so she can sleep. Because the truth was, everything bad would happen. Lawyers, publicity, scandal, narratives. They wouldn't attack me directly. They would simply reshape reality until I didn't fit inside it anymore. And I wasn't afraid of that for myself. I was afraid of what it would do to her. Because she was already learning how to shrink. At school, she learned how to be impressive. At home, she learned how to be obedient. With me, she learned how to be honest. And honesty doesn't survive well in places that run on image. She once told me she felt like she was being watched even when no one was in the room. She said it quietly, like a confession. I feel like I'm not allowed to be wrong. That sentence broke something in me. Because children are supposed to be wrong. They are supposed to fail, to experiment, to be loud and messy and uncertain. That's how you become a person. But she was becoming a product. Polished, optimized, controlled. And the more refined her world became, the more dangerous my presence felt inside it. So they tried to buy me. Not directly, not with cash in an envelope, but with offers, support, opportunities. They suggested I move. They suggested I travel. They suggested I start fresh. Always far from her. Always somewhere that made me less visible. They never said, disappear. They said, this is better for everyone. But better for everyone meant worse for her. So I stayed. Not loudly, Not defiantly, quietly, like I always had. But this time, I stayed where I could still be found. And my daughter noticed. She noticed that I never accepted the offers. She noticed that I didn't leave. She noticed that I didn't complain. She noticed that I didn't fight her mother. I just remained. And there is something powerful about someone who remains without demanding anything in return. Children understand that. They feel it. It tells them something about safety, about reliability, about what doesn't change. She began to talk differently. Less about school, less about achievements, more about how she felt. She told me about the pressure, the expectations, the way her future was being planned like a business expansion. She told me she was afraid of becoming someone she didn't recognize. She asked me once if people could grow up and disappear inside themselves. I told her yes, but I also told her they could choose not to. She held on to that idea like a rope, and that rope slowly pulled her toward me. Not because I was exciting, not because I was impressive, but because I was still enough for her to hear herself. That's when her mother noticed the shift. She noticed my daughter became quieter at home and brighter when she returned from seeing me. She noticed her questions changed. Her resistance grew. Her obedience weakened. And that terrified her, because obedience is easier than understanding. So she tightened control. More schedules, more supervision, more restrictions, less space, less freedom, less choice. And children always react to that in one of two ways. They break, or they wake up. My daughter woke up. She began asking questions no one wanted to answer. About her father, about her past, about why some things were hidden, about why love felt different in different places. And every question she asked weakened the walls around her. Until one day she asked the question that couldn't be managed. Why does my father have to be a secret? No one had a good answer, so they gave her a convenient one. To protect you. But protection doesn't feel like a cage. And she knew that. She knew protection felt like freedom. And cages felt like fear. She started to understand that the story she had been given wasn't complete. That pieces were missing. That the world she lived in depended on those pieces staying missing. And she decided she didn't want to live inside a lie, no matter how beautiful it was. That decision didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived slowly. Like sunrise. Unstoppable. Quiet. She began insisting on seeing me more. On calling me without asking. On mentioning me in conversations. Small rebellions. Invisible to the world. But huge inside a system built on control. And the system reacted. Not with anger. With concern. With softness. With worry. The most dangerous forms of pressure. They told her she was confused. They told her she was too young to understand. They told her she was being influenced. They told her she was idealizing me because I was simple. They told her she didn't see the full picture. But children see the emotional picture long before they see the social one. She didn't care about status. She cared about how she felt. And with me, she felt real. That was the threat. Not that I was her father, but that I was her mirror. And she liked who she saw when she was with me. That's why they couldn't erase me. That's why they couldn't replace me. That's why they couldn't buy me. Because I wasn't competing for power. I was offering presence. And presence is the one thing control can't defeat. Not in the long run. Not in the heart of a child. And deep inside, before she ever said it out loud, before lawyers ever became involved, before decisions were ever forced into daylight, my daughter had already chosen. Not between parents, but between worlds. Between who she was expected to be and who she actually was. And once that choice is made, everything else becomes inevitable. The first time she said she didn't want to go home, she didn't cry. She said it like a fact, like something she had measured carefully inside herself before letting it exist in the world. I don't feel calm there. Not sad, not angry, not scared, not calm. That word stayed with me. Because calm is what children use to tell you they feel safe. And she didn't. She felt managed. Observed. Directed. She felt like a project. And projects don't get to rest. She told me that at home every minute had a purpose. Study. Practice. Preparation. Even fun was scheduled. Even laughter had a time slot. She said when she woke up, she already felt behind. Behind what? I asked. She didn't know. Just behind. That's what pressure does. It creates urgency without meaning. She told me she felt like she was always being shaped into something she couldn't see. And she was afraid that when she finally became it, she wouldn't recognize herself. That fear is heavier than any workload. She started staying silent at dinner. She started answering questions with fewer words. She started watching people instead of responding to them. That's what children do when they stop feeling safe enough to express themselves. They become careful. And careful children grow into anxious adults. She didn't want that. She wanted to breathe. She wanted to be uncertain. She wanted to be allowed to be unfinished. So she came to me with her uncertainty. She asked me if it was okay to not know what she wanted to become. I told her that was the only honest place to start. She asked me if it was okay to disappoint people. I told her that disappointing the wrong people is often the first step toward becoming yourself. She asked me if it was okay to choose something smaller. I told her smaller doesn't mean less. Sometimes it means closer. That answer changed something. Because her world had taught her that bigger was always better. More visibility, more impact, more legacy. But no one had taught her about closeness, about intimacy, about belonging. Those things don't scale. They only deepen. She told me she felt like a guest in her own life. That her room didn't feel like her room. That her achievements didn't feel like hers. That her future felt like someone else's plan. That sentence was the one that finally made me afraid. Not afraid of losing her. Afraid of her losing herself. So I started doing something I had avoided for years. I started telling her the truth. Not the dangerous kind. The emotional kind. I told her that her mother wasn't evil. She was afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of being seen as wrong. I told her that people who build empires often do it because something inside them feels unstable. They create control to compensate for inner uncertainty. She listened quietly, not with judgment, with understanding. That's when I realized my daughter wasn't a child anymore. She was becoming a person, and she was becoming one with empathy. That was Ray. That was powerful, and that was something no amount of wealth could manufacture. She started seeing the pattern. Not just in her mother, in her world. She noticed how people flattered power, how honesty disappeared around status, how conversations were shaped by advantage. She noticed how people performed kindness when it was useful, and withheld it when it wasn't. She started asking why. Why people lied. Why people pretended. Why people traded truth for comfort. Those questions made her lonely, because once you see the performance, it's hard to participate in it. She started feeling out of place in places that once felt normal. That's what awakening feels like. Dislocation. And dislocation always comes before realignment. She began spending more time with me not because she needed escape, but because she needed grounding. With me, she didn't have to perform. She didn't have to impress. She didn't have to optimize herself. She could just exist. She could sit in silence without it being awkward. She could change her mind without consequences. She could be inconsistent without penalty. That's how you discover who you are. Not by becoming something impressive, but by removing everything that isn't you. And that process is slow, quiet, invisible, but unstoppable. Her mother noticed the changes before anyone else. Mothers always do. She noticed the distance, the resistance, the way her daughter stopped seeking approval. The way her daughter stopped responding to pressure. She felt her authority weakening. And authority rarely disappears peacefully. So she did what powerful people do when they feel threatened. She called it concern. She called it care. She called it protection. She said her daughter was confused, influenced, manipulated. She said I was filling her head with ideas. She said I was turning her against her own future. She said I was selfish. She said I was irresponsible. She said I was reckless. She said everything except the one thing that was true. That her daughter was thinking for herself. That was the real danger. Not me. Autonomy. They brought in counselors, experts, advisors, people with credentials, people who spoke gently and asked leading questions, people who framed control as safety, people who framed obedience as health, people who framed resistance as pathology. They tried to diagnose her independence. They tried to label her awakening. They tried to treat her clarity like a symptom. She saw through it, not intellectually, Emotionally, she felt that something was off, that she was being managed again, just with softer hands. She didn't rebel. She didn't shout. She withdrew. And withdrawal is the most dangerous form of resistance, because it happens silently. And by the time you notice it, it's already complete. She stopped sharing, stopped trusting, stopped opening. At home, she became polite, efficient, compliant, everything they wanted. But inside, she had already left. She had already chosen a different allegiance. Not to me, to herself. That's what frightened them most. Not that she preferred her father, but that she no longer belonged to the system that defined her. She had stepped outside it, and systems cannot tolerate what they cannot control. So they escalated, not with force, with fear. They showed her consequences. They warned her of loss. They suggested regret. They painted futures where she would fail without their guidance. They predicted suffering. They framed dependence as love. They framed freedom as danger. They framed the unknown as irresponsible. They framed my life as small, as limited, as unsafe. And she listened, not because she believed them, but because she wanted to understand. She weighed everything carefully, like someone making the most important decision of their life, which she was. She asked me if I was afraid of her choosing her mother. I told her no, because I wasn't raising her to choose me. I was raising her to choose herself. That answer settled something, because she realized no one else was giving her that permission. And that permission changed everything. It removed fear from the decision. It removed guilt. It removed obligation. It allowed her to see clearly. And clarity always feels like relief. She told me she felt like she had been holding her breath her entire life. And now she was finally exhaling. That's what real safety feels like. Not protection, not control, not luxury. Breath, space, room to be. And once someone feels that, they cannot return to suffocation. Not willingly, not knowingly. She wasn't running away from her mother. She was running toward herself. And that is the one journey no one can stop. No matter how much power they have. No matter how many systems they control. No matter how convincing their arguments are. Because identity is stronger than influence. And truth is stronger than fear. And my daughter had found both. And she wasn't going to lose them again. When her mother finally confronted me, she did it politely. That was what surprised me the most. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, no threat. Only concern, carefully shaped into something that sounded reasonable. She told me she was worried about her daughter. She said she felt her slipping away. She said she didn't recognize her anymore. She said she was afraid she was losing influence. She didn't say control. She said influence. Because influence sounds softer, kinder, more acceptable. She said her daughter was changing too fast, thinking too much, questioning things she didn't need to question. She said she was becoming difficult, independent. She said those words as if they were symptoms, as if autonomy were a disease. She told me that children need structure. They need guidance. They need direction. She told me that freedom without discipline becomes chaos. She told me that I was confusing her. She told me that my way of living was too uncertain, too unplanned, too risky. She said she was just trying to protect her. I listened, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand what she was really afraid of. And what she was afraid of wasn't her daughter's safety. It was her daughter's unpredictability. You can't manage someone who thinks for themselves. You can't shape someone who refuses the mold. You can't build a legacy on a child who doesn't want to be part of it. That was the real danger. She was losing her future asset, and she didn't know how to grieve that without calling it a loss. So she called it concern. She told me I was being selfish by encouraging her to choose something smaller. She said I was limiting her potential. She said I was stealing her opportunities. She said I was putting my comfort over her future. She said all of this calmly, gently, as if she were doing me a favor by explaining my own wrongdoing to me. I asked her a simple question. Have you asked her what she wants? She hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. She said children don't always know what they want. I said sometimes they know what they feel. She said feelings change. I said identity doesn't. That's when she became uncomfortable. Because identity is not something you can negotiate. It's not something you can restructure. It either emerges or it fractures. She told me she didn't want to fight. She wanted cooperation. She wanted us to be reasonable adults. She wanted what was best for her daughter. I told her I wanted the same thing, but we did not agree on what best meant. To her, best meant advantage. To me, best meant alignment. Advantage is what you gain. Alignment is who you become. And the cost of advantage without alignment is always paid later. By the child. She told me she had given her daughter everything. I told her that giving is not the same as allowing. She told me she had sacrificed everything for her. I told her that sacrifice doesn't give you ownership. She told me her daughter owed her. I told her children don't owe their parents. Parents owe their children. That ended the conversation. Not because it became hostile, but because it reached a place where there was no overlap left. We were standing on different definitions of love. And love built on different definitions becomes incompatible. After that, things moved quietly. Meetings were arranged. People were consulted. Professionals were brought in. Not to understand, to evaluate, to measure, to assess, to determine whether my daughter's desires were valid or influenced, whether her feelings were real or manipulated, whether her discomfort was natural or induced, whether her resistance was healthy or pathological. She became a case, a file, a subject. Her inner world was translated into checklists, her emotions into data, her clarity into symptoms. And the more they studied her, the more distant she became. Not from me, from them. She learned quickly what to say, what not to say, which words triggered concern, which ideas triggered intervention. She became fluent in survival. She presented what they wanted to see and kept what she needed to protect. That's when I realized she was no longer a child being shaped. She was a person navigating a system, and she was doing it alone. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed where I was. Available, open, unreactive. I didn't argue with the experts. I didn't fight the narrative. I didn't try to win, because winning would make me the enemy. And I didn't want to be the enemy. I wanted to be the refuge. And refuge is quiet. Refuge does not demand. It receives. So I received her. Every version. The tired one. The confused one. The angry one. The calm one. The hopeful one. The hopeless one. All of it. Without commentary. Without correction. Without agenda. That was what she needed most. A place where she didn't have to defend herself. A place where she didn't have to justify her feelings. A place where she didn't have to be coherent. Just human. And that humanity healed something. Slowly. Subtly. It reminded her that she wasn't broken. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't confused. She was responding appropriately to a world that didn't fit her. That's not dysfunction. That's intelligence. That's awareness. That's integrity. And integrity is dangerous to systems built on compliance. So the system responded. They reduced our time together. They monitored our conversations. They framed me as a risk. Not because I had done anything harmful, but because I was not useful to their goals. They said I lacked structure. They said I lacked ambition. They said I lacked discipline. They said I lacked vision. They never said I lacked care. They never said I lacked presence. They never said I lacked love. Because those things were undeniable. So they attacked everything else. But my daughter saw what was happening. She saw how the narrative was being shaped. She saw how I was being framed. She saw how her reality was being edited. And she made a decision. Not emotionally. Logically. She realized that if she didn't assert herself now, she never would. That if she allowed others to define her choices now, they would define her life forever. She realized that this was the moment. Not later. Not when she was older. Not when she was stronger. Now. Because now was when she still had access to her own voice. So she used it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Clearly. She said she wanted to live with me. She didn't say she hated her mother. She didn't say she was running away. She didn't say she was escaping. She said she wanted to choose. And that was the one thing no one had prepared for. Choice. Because systems are built to offer options. Not freedom. She wasn't choosing between two homes. She was choosing between two definitions of herself. One built for her. One discovered by her. And she chose the one that felt like truth. That choice didn't feel triumphant. It felt calm. Like something settling into place. Like something returning home. And that calm was more powerful than any argument, more convincing than any evidence, more unstoppable than any authority. Because calm does not need to prove itself. It only needs to be felt. And she felt it. For the first time in her life. She felt like she was where she was supposed to be. And no amount of power in the world could take that away from her again. When she finally moved in with me, there were no headlines, no drama, no victory, just 2 bags, a quiet car ride, and a long exhale. She looked out the window most of the way, not because she was sad, but because she was processing something new. Freedom is not loud. It's gentle. It feels like space. It feels like your shoulders dropping without realizing they were tense. That was what I saw in her. Not excitement. Relief. The apartment didn't change. The walls were still plain. The furniture still mismatched. The sound still familiar. But she changed the moment she crossed the doorway. Her breath slowed. Her movements softened. Her voice lowered. She walked through the space like someone entering water after standing too long in the heat. She touched things. The table. The couch. The window. Not because they were special, but because they were haze now. She chose her room. The smallest one. She said she didn't need much space. She needed quiet. She needed a place where nothing was expected of her. Where nothing was watching her. Where nothing was waiting for her to perform. That night, she slept for 12 hours. Not the restless kind. The deep kind. The kind that comes when the nervous system finally believes it is safe. That sleep was more meaningful than any celebration. In the weeks that followed, something subtle happened. She began to laugh again. Not politely. Not carefully. But unexpectedly. She began to speak without measuring. She began to ask questions without fear of consequences. She began to change her mind without apology. She began to take up space in her own life. She would sit on the floor while she read. She would sing quietly while she washed dishes. She would leave notebooks open, thoughts unfinished, ideas half-formed. She stopped needing everything to be complete. She allowed herself to be in process. And that was the most radical change of all. Because her old world was built on completion, on outcomes, on certainty, on performance. This world was built on becoming. And becoming is never finished. At first, she expected something bad to happen. That's what happens when you leave control. You wait for punishment, for consequences, for loss. She kept checking her phone, waiting for messages, waiting for anger, waiting for pressure, waiting for guilt. It didn't come, not in the way she feared. Her mother tried once more, not with lawyers, with sadness. She called and asked if she was happy. That question carried weight, because happiness can feel like betrayal when someone else is suffering. My daughter answered honestly. She said she was calm. There was a long silence on the line. Then her mother said she didn't understand. My daughter said she didn't need her to. That was the moment the roles reversed. The child became the stable one. The adult became the confused one. Not because of failure, but because control had been mistaken for connection. And when control is removed, the illusion collapses. Her mother wasn't cruel. She was lost. Lost in a story where success replaced intimacy. Where legacy replaced relationship. Where building something replaced being with someone. She didn't know how to relate to a daughter who was no longer an extension of her identity. She had to meet her as a person. And she didn't know how to do that yet. That was her work, not ours. Our work was simpler. We lived. We cooked. We walked. We talked. We sat in silence. We argued about small things. We laughed about nothing. We built routines that had no audience. And that was the point. A life that is not performed becomes honest. Honesty is uncomfortable at first. You feel things you used to avoid. You face questions you used to outrun. You notice emptiness where noise used to be. But emptiness is not a problem. It's an invitation. She began exploring what she liked. Not what she was good at. Not what she was praised for. What she liked. She discovered she liked writing in messy notebooks. She liked walking without destination. She liked listening to people talk about their lives. She liked observing patterns. She liked noticing how humans behave. She liked understanding. She liked depth. She liked meaning. Those preferences didn't fit neatly into a career path. And that was okay. Not everything meaningful becomes profitable. Not everything valuable becomes visible. She was becoming someone who chose significance over success. And that frightened people. Because significance cannot be controlled. It cannot be standardized. It cannot be marketed. It can only be lived. Her old world tried to call her back. With offers. With invitations. With reminders of what she was leaving behind. But she wasn't leaving something behind. She was stepping into something. That distinction mattered. She wasn't rejecting wealth. She was rejecting dependence on it for identity. She wasn't rejecting opportunity. She was rejecting obligation disguised as opportunity. She wasn't rejecting her mother. She was rejecting being owned. And ownership, once seen, cannot be unseen. She visited her mother occasionally. On her terms. With boundaries. With clarity. She didn't go to be managed. She went to connect. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But she no longer lost herself inside it. She returned whole. And that wholeness was new. She stopped fragmenting herself to fit different environments. She became consistent. And consistency is what creates inner peace. One evening, she asked me if I ever regretted being poor. I laughed. I said I had never been poor. I had been limited, but never poor. Poverty is not lack of money. It is lack of choice, lack of agency, lack of self. I had always had myself, so I had always been wealthy enough. She understood that. She said she felt rich now, not because she had less, but because she needed less. That sentence held more wisdom than most books. We don't suffer from lack. We suffer from excess without meaning. She had chosen meaning, and that choice had reorganized her entire life. Her nervous system calmed. Her mind slowed. Her heart opened. Not dramatically, naturally. She became kinder, not performatively, genuinely. She became more patient, more attentive, more present. She began noticing other people's pain, not to fix it, but to acknowledge it. That made her human in a world that trained people to be impressive. She had chosen humanity, and humanity is not efficient. It is not scalable. It is not profitable, but it is real, and real is rare. That's why it feels like treasure. People still called me poor, but now I knew what they meant. They meant I wasn't participating in their game. They meant I wasn't chasing what they were chasing. They meant I wasn't building what they were building. They meant I was invisible to their metrics. And I was grateful, because visibility is expensive. It costs you your attention, your privacy, your peace, yourself. I had chosen invisibility, and in that invisibility, I found everything that mattered. A daughter who trusted me, a home that felt safe, a life that felt honest, a heart that felt open. That is not poverty. That is abundance. And no one can take that away. Not with money, not with power, not with influence, not with pressure, because it is not something you own. It is something you are. And once you become it, you don't need anything else.